It is December 1st. It is a new quarter, a new study. Does everybody have a book for this quarter, including this morning? I'll take that as a yes. I feel all out of sorts, to be honest. For some reason, Santa Claus decided to come early this year for one of the members of our household and brought a little puppy. And it's like having a newborn baby again because he didn't want to sleep a whole lot last night, which means he didn't want us to sleep a whole lot last night. So if my eyes look all red and I look wired, and if Tabby's head starts falling down, that's why, okay? So apologies in advance and for all the scrambling this morning. Can't blame it all on the dog or Santa Claus, but this, I think, to my knowledge, is actually, I know for a fact it is the first time that we have studied anywhere in the Psalms since we've been here in the last almost 8 years now. And it may be the first time I've done any study in the book of Psalms, from the Psalms, quarter-long study anyway, from the Psalms. It's a unique book. Obviously, it's a very beloved book. That's why a lot of times if you have a New Testament copy of the Bible, just the New Testament, a lot of times the Psalms will be in there with it at the end, and you'll see a lot of copies of the New Testament, like pocket New Testaments that'll actually say the New Testament and the Psalms. Sometimes Proverbs might be in there too, but usually it's like New Testament and Psalms. What kind of connection do the Psalms have with the New Testament? Why would it become a common thing to include the Psalms with your copy of the New Testament? Well, I don't really know the answer, but I assume the answer is probably just because of how much people love the Psalms and get from them, like to read them. They hold a special place for a lot of people, mainly because they are almost unequivocally an outpouring from somebody's heart, from some child of God's heart. Is the book of Psalms. It's a book. When we say this is a book of Psalms, kind of alluded to this Wednesday night in our little Thanksgiving devotional thing, that what we're saying is we're looking at a book of songs, psalms, hymns. Think about what Paul said in Ephesians 5:19, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Well, those three categories, if we want to call it three different categories, they all have one thing in common at least. They're all musical in nature. They all are what we would simply call songs. That's what the Psalms are. They're not prayers per se. They read like prayers a lot of times, don't they? When you read it, anytime something begins like, "Give ear to my words, O Lord," that's the beginning of the 5th Psalm. It sounds like a prayer, doesn't it? Because it's somebody that's speaking to God. So, but really, they're songs. And you could kind of, maybe they cross over a little bit. They're very similar in nature, I guess, in the psalms and prayers rather, songs and prayers, when you read the words at least. It is the longest book of the Bible. It's the easiest book probably to open your Bible at a random page and find the Psalms because it's so big. 150 chapters, 150 Psalms in the book of Psalms. It's actually 3 books, I believe, maybe 4. I didn't write that part down, but and your Bible might have it divided that way very subtly, probably 4 or 5 maybe. Yeah, book 4. Let's see. Book 4 begins in the 90th Psalm, And that's all. Book 5 begins in 107. So I believe, 5 books, collection of Psalms, at least 5. I don't see a 6, but written by many different people. Well, I'll say many, several, and several who are unknown, anonymous, unattributed. But some of them are written by some people that we know very well. Anybody want to guess this? Okay, we'll start off real easy. Anybody want to guess who wrote the most of them? David. Now, if you like numbers, in terms of stats, okay, you know I'm not a fan of numbers in general, but I like these kind of numbers. David wrote greater than or equal to, we'll say, 73 of the 150 Psalms. Almost half are attributed to David. Now, let me just make this note very, very quickly. I don't know if I've ever seen an English Bible that did not have superscriptions at the beginning of several of the Psalms, usually in maybe all capital letters or something like that, that say, for instance, Psalm 3, a psalm of David, when he fled from Absalom, his son. Well, those words are not inspired, okay? The Holy Spirit had nothing to do with that, probably, very, very likely. That doesn't mean it's not true, though, okay? It's very, very ancient. These superscriptions are very ancient, so they are very, very old, but they are not necessarily written by whoever wrote the psalm. So if David indeed did write Psalm 3, it's not like David, it is very unlikely that David himself wrote at the beginning, this is a psalm of David whenever he fled from Absalom, his son. All right, okay, so just want to make that note. It's not necessarily inspired, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. So we can just, assume that they're all accurate. So assuming that, David wrote 73 of the 150 Psalms. I could go through and tell you which ones, but that'll take a long time. Take about a little over 73 seconds probably. So we won't do that. Anybody want to guess who wrote the second most? Now this one's a lot trickier. It's actually could be considered a trick question, but we're not counting the unattributed, okay? Unattributed takes second place with 50. There are 50 who are anonymous, who are not attributed to anybody. Now, for all we know, some of those could have been written by David. That's why I say David wrote greater than or equal to 73, because 73 are actually said to be written by David. And I guess technically it could have been less than 73 if he didn't write some of the ones that it says he wrote. So anybody know who wrote the second most? It's a lot less than 73, I'll tell you that. Nope. Good guess, because he's in there. He's in here. Nope, good guess. He wrote one more than Moses did. I know this is tough because he's not very known. He's not somebody who's a well-known Bible character, except for the 12 Psalms that he wrote. His name is Asaph. So that might come as a shock, I'm assuming, but based on your answers that, okay, David, duh, because, some people probably think he wrote all 150 of them. But Asaph is the second most? Don't even know who Asaph is. He wrote 12, at least, assuming that none of the anonymous ones were written by him. Anybody want to guess who's third most? I'll give you a hint. Nobody said it yet. Nope. Keep reading. Are you reading the list? Read it. Keep going. You'll hit it. Sons of Korah, yeah. The sons of Korah are attributed, 11 of them are attributed to the sons of Korah. And if this Korah is the same Korah that we read about earlier in the Old Testament, he is a somewhat known character, not necessarily for good reason, but Korah was, I believe, he was the one who was swallowed up by the earth when he launched a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. If that's the same Korah, now it may not be the same Korah. It may be some other Korah that we've never heard of before. But at any rate, it probably is, because depending on how we interpret whether or not every single descendant of Korah was also consumed in that tragedy, probably is a different Korah, but I just bring him up because that's the only place we read about. That's the only Korah I know about other than this one. All right, now it drops quite a bit. So David 73, Anonymous 50, Asaph 12, sons of Korah 11. Now it drops quite a bit. Solomon's next. He wrote 2 of them. At least 2. Then, sort of a tricky one, Heman the Ezrahite, that's Psalm 88, but that one's tricky because Psalm 88 is also attributed to Asaph. So I think it says it's a psalm of Asaph, but then it says it's a miktam of Heman the Ezrahite. And that may be a musical term, which would seem to suggest that maybe Heman the Ezrahite wrote the music. He's responsible for the music of it. Sometimes you'll see in our songbook, at least back when we used the songbook, I guess it might be on the screen sometimes, it'll say words, this person, music, this person, and that may be what's going on in Psalm 88. Then there's Ethan the Ezrahite. He wrote one as well, Psalm 89. And then Moses, only one, Psalm 90. So interesting little spread there. David, Asaph, sons of Korah, Solomon, Ethan the Ezrahite, Moses, and possibly Heman the Ezrahite. And then 50, 1/3 of them exactly, written by people. Could be David, could be Solomon, could be, who knows, just not attributed to anybody. So lots of different time periods. Moses and David, significantly separated by time, and different circumstances, different situations. What I find to be one of the most fascinating things about looking into the Psalms is any time, I'll take, for instance, Psalm 3 again, when it says a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom. Now, we have the record of when David fled from Absalom in 2 Samuel 15. So what I've done is I've done a little line next to that and written 2 Samuel 15, because 2 Samuel 15 gives the context of Psalm 3. So you can read 2 Samuel 15, and then there's nothing from David's perspective in 2 Samuel 15, but it's from the perspective of whoever wrote 2 Samuel. But then you turn to Psalm 3, and you get like an inside look at what's going on in him, inside of his mind and heart during that time. And it's just very helpful, I think. And anytime those little indicators, and I'll point some of those out anytime we come across. This is a 2-part study. We're going to be somewhere else next quarter, and then we're coming back to the Psalms in the summer. But even with 2 quarters, we're not going to be able to look at very many of the Psalms, relatively speaking, at all. But anytime we come across some that have a connection to somewhere else in the New Testament or the Old Testament, like I said, the Bible is always the Bible's best commentary, and this is some of those examples. Psalm 3, 2 Samuel 15, they go together, and we should put them together. Your Bible might have a reference there already, but I like to write it out because sometimes those chain references are not very noticeable, easily noticeable. Today, surprisingly, we're not going to be starting in Psalm 1. We're going to be starting in Psalm 2. Some of the categories of these Psalms, we got, like I said, hymns of praise. So sometimes they're hymns of praise. We looked at several of those Wednesday night because we might, praise and thanksgiving sort of go hand in hand to an extent. They're very similar. Sometimes they're sad. Lamentations, which, by the way, Lamentations, the book, is also presumably a at least could be converted into a song, or maybe has been. It's sort of got that characteristic. Some of the Psalms are very sad and gloomy. Sometimes David's pouring out his heart about his sin that he was hiding. Very powerful psalm. Then he talks about, the burst of happiness that came when he finally confessed his sin and got rid of it. So got Psalm 51, I believe, is the infamous psalm where David is talking about how the sin that he kept inside was just breaking him apart inside. It was eating him up like his bones, eating his bones away. That may be a different one, actually, but I think Psalm 32 is one of those others where that related to David's sin being forgiven. So then there are songs of thanksgiving. I guess really we looked at those Wednesday. Royal psalms, wisdom psalms, probably some other categories we could throw in there. But the Jews definitely held the psalms in a very high place. A lot of the things that they would sing in the synagogue were just the psalms, certain psalms written to music. And maybe, for all we know, maybe they had the ability, the capacity to know the music that was actually written to the psalm, whereas, that's been lost to us, really. We're not really sure how the music would have gone, but they may have. So whenever they go in the synagogue and they're going to sing, it's called the Hallel. I brought this up Wednesday and I forgot to look it up again, so I just did now. It's Psalm 113 through 118. All six of those is the Hallel. So they would recite them in song or whatever, I guess, maybe chant or some way. So these psalms would be known by heart to the Jews, more so maybe than most other places in the Old Testament, and because they did sing some of them, and we do too sometimes. There aren't many of our hymns that we sing that are taken directly from the Psalms, but some of them are very, very close, a few of them at least. So they have a lot of value, full of emotion. I would say that there's emotion in many Bible books, but nobody can deny that the Psalms are full of emotion, more so than most. Happiness, sorrow, just absolute heartbreak, all sorts of emotions. And whenever we look at specific of the Psalms that we're going to look at, we probably will ask some questions, and we should, anytime we consider the Psalms, like what was going on that made the writer have this outburst of either pain or happiness. If he's praising God, why is he praising God? And most of the time, he'll say why. Why is he crying out to God in pain and sorrow? Why? What happened? What exactly happened? You might see somebody crying in real life somewhere, and that's probably the first question you think to yourself is, I wonder what's wrong, right? What's wrong with what happened? So if we read somebody crying out to God, then why? What's going on? And of course, again, Psalms like the third Psalm tell us what was going on, in the superscription at least. Other times we might have to find it in the text of the Psalm itself. So like I said, we're going to start in the second Psalm. The lesson is called Kings and My King. Kings and My King. They're obviously two different things. We're dealing with the King of Kings when we're talking about God. Any thoughts, comments, questions? That was kind of a lot, I guess, by way of introduction. Here's how the psalm begins. First three verses say, why? By the way, this is one of the unattributed psalms. I'm sure you noticed. The first two are unattributed. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against Jehovah and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. So it begins with a question here. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? If somebody would be so kind as to turn to Acts 4, verse 25 for just a moment. By the way, I forgot to mention, the Psalms are the most quoted book, the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. I don't have a number stat for you there, but it is the most often quoted. Acts 4:25. Hey, guess what? I just noticed. Sorry for being irresponsible. I'm glad I put greater than or equal to 73, because Peter, is it Peter speaking? No, it's the brothers praying. They seem to believe that Psalm 2 was written by David. Just now caught that. It's amazing what you can learn when you actually look. So whoever copied the Psalms didn't attribute it to David, but the Christians did in Acts 4. Somebody read verse 25 there. Middle of a sentence, but it's okay. Acts 4:25, if I didn't say that.
You spoke by the Holy Spirit through the mouth of your servant, our father David. Why do the nations rage and the people plot in vain?
Okay. Well, that backfired on me. Mine says something different in that verse. Anybody see something different? His is the same as the Psalm, which is probably correct. Huh? Yeah. Okay, there's the word I was looking for. And this is not the only place where this happens, but the psalmist says, why do the nations rage? And I guess, is that New King James says nations maybe also? But a lot of times when it's quoted in the New Testament, when a passage that has nations in the Old Testament is quoted in the New Testament, it'll say Gentiles, which sort of has a different ring to it as far as it's sort of a buzzword in the New Testament. So basically what I'm pointing out is they're the same thing. The nations, from the Jewish perspective, are Gentiles. So what does that mean? Well, that would mean that anytime that there's an Old Testament prophecy about the nations, it's a prophecy about the Gentiles. And that's important in a lot of places because there are Old Testament prophecies that incorporate the Gentiles utterly, against the expectation of the Jews, of most of the Jews. But there it is. Nations equal Gentiles, same group of people. So that's who he's talking about, is those that are not God's people, and especially maybe the rulers and those in power. He says he's just sort of contemplating, why is this the case that the Gentiles, the nations around, are raging and the peoples are plotting in vain. The NIV renders the word rage conspire. So why do they conspire? Why are they conspiring? Which is sort of the same as plot. So might be a little redundant, but who are they plotting against, though? Who are they raging against? God. Okay. Says Jehovah in verse 2, and his anointed. And if you notice, I'm assuming maybe in most translations, the word anointed is capitalized. Is it capitalized in your Bible? No? Okay, most. It probably wasn't capitalized in the Hebrew, but that is an indication that this was taken to be a messianic psalm. The fact that that word anointed is capitalized is making it a reference to a specific person. Now, if David actually did write this psalm, like the Christians seem to believe, then in a way he himself would have been Jehovah's anointed, wouldn't he? Because the kings were anointed before, as part of the ceremony. I guess a lot of the priests were also, there was that custom. But since it's capitalized here, we're talking about a specific, special anointed person. And just to look ahead, just as Mary said, it's the Christ. The Christ is the anointed. It's messianic in scope here. So we got Jehovah and his anointed. And what they're wanting is, they're saying, basically, we don't want anything to do with them. Let's burst their bonds apart. Let's break their authority, rule. Let's rebel. We don't want their cords attached to us. Let's break it apart. But, a key phrase here is, it's in vain. Any plotting, scheming, conspiring, and raging that the nations do, or anybody does, against God is ultimately in vain. Because you can't do it. You can rebel against God, but you can't rebel against God successfully, ultimately. Because, as Paul very powerfully declared to the Athenians in Acts 17, he has fixed a day in which he's going to judge the world in righteousness by the man he's chosen. Guess who that man was? Happened to be the same as his anointed that the psalmist is talking about here. So, yeah, the nations can rage, the pagans, the heathens, the world can plot against God, but ultimately, God's going to win. God will win. Verse 4 goes on to say, he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. Jehovah said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So, anytime you have God being characterized as saying, you are my son, the alarm bells will probably go off, right? Because we've read other places where God has said that, haven't we? You are my son, or this is my son, in whom I'm well pleased. You are my son, he says here. Today I have begotten you. God laughs at man's feeble attempts. In the perspective and context of this psalm, he laughs. But you know what? Really, I would say it's more like crying at the same time. God, he doesn't laugh in the sense of he takes pleasure when men bring damnation onto themselves. But he laughs in the sense of like a grown man might, a child, a little boy or something is trying to, fight him or something, like they're playing around and he's going for him and he can't really do anything because he's a grown man and he's a kid and it's kind of funny. It's like what he's feisty, but what can he do? It's just silly fun. He laughs in the sense of, why do they think that they can prevail? It's a joke when man tries to defeat God in any way. It's a feeble endeavor. But then comes the wrath, he says. God's going to speak to him in his wrath. And here's another messianic reference. I've set my king on Zion. You're my son, today I've begotten you. I'm going to make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, dash them into pieces. You know what? There's almost no doubt about it that the Jews, maybe to this day, but especially in Jesus' day, would have viewed this psalm as an obvious reference to the Messianic kingdom that they were expecting, where Israel becomes the superpower of the world. Can't you see it being twisted that way? The king that God has set up in Zion, or on Zion, his holy hill, he's going to make the nations his heritage. He's going to make the ends of the earth his possession. Global dominion, right? He's going to break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Strong, dominant, irresistible, because God's going to do it. And sadly, this is what the Jews were waiting for. But is that what the psalmist was, by inspiration here, looking forward to? Well, whether the psalmist, if it was David, whether David saw that far or not, it seems pretty clear he wasn't talking about himself, because I don't think David ever expected for himself to rule over the entire world. So when he says, God is saying, I've set my king on Zion, he's clearly not talking about himself. And if David didn't write it, he's clearly not talking about whoever was the king. This is a different king. This is a different kind of king, which again is why the word king in your translation might be capitalized, just like anointed was capitalized. And it makes it even more clear whenever verse 7 says, you are my son, today I've begotten you. This is a prophecy of a totally different nature than just earthly dominion. And then Jesus comes 1,000 years later. He is the Messiah. He is the Christ. And how much of this stuff did he actually do? How many people, how many nations did he declare to have authority over? I didn't mean for that to be a trick question. What's that? Yeah, none. Not even Israel, really. How many did he break with a rod of iron? Same answer. How many did he dash into pieces like a potter's vessel? Zilch. But at the same time, he did, didn't he? See, this is the nature of messianic prophecy. We could come to a couple of different conclusions based on the messianic nature of this and any other prophecy like it. Either it hasn't happened yet, because I think everybody would agree Jesus definitely didn't do it when he was here the first time, right? If we interpret it this way. So either it hasn't happened yet, or maybe it did happen, and it just didn't happen in the way that some people say that it was supposed to happen. It's not a prophecy of what literally is going to take place on the earth. He's not actually going to rule over the whole world on the earth. But his rule and reign were of a different nature. Isn't that what Jesus himself, at least if he didn't declare it explicitly, he implied it? Especially, at the very least, when he said, my kingdom's not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. It's not like it's not like your kingdom, Pilate, or your master's kingdom, that Caesar. It's not like that. It's different. And in a way, Jesus did break the world with a rod of iron, didn't he?
He destroyed that Roman rule eventually.
Mm-hmm. Rome fell. He literally changed the world. Even, this is how much he changed the world. Even if you take out the element of the biggest element, that he died for the sins of the world, let's just say you believe that's a bunch of baloney, and Jesus was just a man, influential, powerful man, but he was just a man. And all that sin stuff is silly. You know, that's just something that people made up. Even if you believe that, he still changed the world.
The whole world measures the year that it is.
Yeah.
Based on him.
Yeah.
Even countries that don't.
In the Western world, at least,
There may be some that don't.
there may be. You can change the initials all you want, the abbreviation, which people have already done, right? You ever heard of BCE? No? Nobody's ever heard of BCE? It's the one, that's what you'll probably see more often than not nowadays. You know what BCE means? It's the same as BC, but the abbreviation is totally different. No, before the Common Era. So if we say David wrote around 1000 BCE, David wrote about 1,000 years before the Common Era. But you know what? The number is still counting from Jesus. The number's the same. So you're still counting, no matter what you call it. So now they've changed it from BC and AD to BCE and CE. I don't know why they didn't call it ACE, but you know it's BCE and CE, the Common Era. We're in the 2024th year of the Common Era. It's just silly. But the point is, no matter what you call it, the number is still counting. Jesus is still the epicenter of the way that the civilized Western world counts time. He changed the world. So in that sense, he did break it in pieces with a rod of iron, and he did dash it in pieces like a potter's vessel, just not in the way the Jews were wanting him to and expecting him to. And the reason I say he did do these things is because there are still many people who claim to be Christians who are still, ironically, waiting for Jesus to come back and do the very thing the Jews thought he was going to do the first time. And it blows my mind how, now these are people who actually claim to believe in Jesus, who still think he's going to do what the mistake the Jews made, thinking that he was going to do. But he's not, because he's already done it. He just did it in a way that is not of this world, because his kingdom is not of this world. Okay, moving on then to this last section, he says, "Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve Jehovah with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him." So, starts with the question, right? Why do the nations do this? Why are they raging against God? It's not a smart thing. It's not wise. See, like a cobra in the wilderness or something, and you see somebody kind of prodding at him, poking at him. He's like, that's not smart. What are you doing? You're putting yourself in a heap of danger here. Why would the nations poke and prod at God? Taunt him and test him and plot against him. It's silly. You can't win. So he sort of comes full circle and says, you need to be wise. Wise up. Serve Jehovah with fear. Stop rebelling against him. Serve Jehovah with fear. Rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, his anointed, and you'll be blessed. You'll be blessed. Everyone who takes refuge in Jehovah God and his anointed will be blessed. But the only thing that can await for those who rage and plot is what? Verse 5, wrath. Verse 5, fury. Verse 12, anger and wrath. That's all there is to that. Jesus, I think it could be interpreted in multiple ways, but verse 12 seems to be the word his and him at the end in the second half of verse 12 seem to be a reference to the Son. So, talking about Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah. The Son is the nearest possible antecedent, right, in grammar. It doesn't go back to verse 11 with Jehovah, but it just goes back to the beginning of verse 12 with the Son. So he's talking about, blessed are those who take refuge in him, the Christ, which shows Jesus, he's the only way. Pretty sure Jesus said that, didn't he? John 14:6. Okay, some applications then. No matter how elaborate or ingenious, the plans of man to rebel against the rule of God will fail. We pretty much touched on that. Jeremiah 10:23, one of my favorite scriptures. It scrolls on our sign pretty much all day, every day. I know, O Jehovah, that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his steps. Man is not able to direct his own steps successfully. Now, God made us to where we can direct our own steps, but without God, we ain't going to be going the right way. And Jeremiah knew that. As a prophet, he should have known, and he did, and he declared it. The way of man is not in himself. You can't just think that you know better than God. Number two, although people can often recognize when they're enslaved by certain actions or desires, they rarely recognize that the way to freedom demands a devotion that is just as strong. Paul talked about that in Romans 6. He said, do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, whether it's of sin, which leads to death, or obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. So every single human being is a slave. Period. You will never not be a slave. The question is, what's your master? Who are you a slave, or what are you a slave of? Sin. Those who haven't come to Christ are slaves of sin. Those who do come to Christ, as this says, with a devotion that's just as powerful as the pull of sin was before, the pull to Jesus is just as powerful as the pull away from Jesus was before, then you're a slave of God, Christ. We talked about James last Sunday afternoon. He called himself a slave of Jesus Christ our Lord. And that's what every Christian is, ideally. It's what every Christian is supposed to be. Finally, number 3, Psalm 2 establishes the identity of God's anointed. He is the Son of God who rules as King. He is the Christ. Another quote from the second Psalm, apparently, in Acts 13, and Peter's speech there. Can't overlook the fact that the church is in view here, because the church is the kingdom of Christ. The kingdom, when he says, I've set my king on Zion, that's a spiritual prophecy. He's not talking about Jerusalem. He's talking about the new Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem, the church of Jesus Christ.